This is chapter 48, the immune system in animals. Kind of a timely lecture here, always a good one to learn about the immune system, especially with all that's going on now. Understanding how our immune system works helps you to be better informed when you hear things on the news about vaccines and whatnot. You have a better understanding of that. So you really want to pay attention to this, not just for the sake of the course, but maybe also for your own real life. Okay, so animals are going to fight infections and diseases with their immune system. So your immune system is part of your body's lymphatic system. And your immune system is made up of two different branches of immunity. You have your innate defenses, which are things that are going to pretty much protect you from any invading organism or virus. And then you have your adaptive immunity, where you have various very specific immune responses to different pathogens, and a pathogen being anything that's going to cause disease. So your innate immunity is, we're going to see, very general, whereas adaptive is specific. So adaptive immunity recognizes various pathogens using B cell and T cell receptors. Antigen presentation is how this type of immunity is activated, and then also response and memory, so that when we come into contact with a pathogen again, we're ready to defend it very quickly. We'll also look at how the immune system is affected by not working correctly, and we'll see some examples of that. So you want to recognize the term pathogen as being any disease-causing agent. Now, I don't like that it says organisms there because it's not always an organism. Okay, a virus is technically not an organism, so a virus is a non-living entity. But everything else here is a living pathogen. Bacteria, parasite, fungi, and protists can all cause infections or diseases, and they're known as pathogens. If an animal contracts a viral illness or a bacterial illness, it may, depending on the severity, recover from and even become immune to the disease, meaning that you're protected against the pathogen again. So the system responsible for the defense against this is the immune system, and that provides your immunity. So the immune system's success depends on three key processes. The first thing, and the simplest thing, would be preventing the entry of potential pathogens. So obviously something like skin is going to be a barrier. It's going to protect, right? Bodily fluids, mucus, saliva, all of these things kind of prevent pathogens. But let's say something still gets in. So detecting the pathogen, so knowing self from non-self, is an important distinction that the immune system makes. So knowing that this is something that does not belong in the body, we need to get rid of it, and that's what lends to number 3, going after and eliminating the pathogen before it causes serious infection, disease, problem to the animal. Immune system cells that are always ready to confer innate immunity look for anything. Okay, so these are going to be cells that just go after any pathogen. Adaptive immunity is referring to cells that are selectively activated and tailor their response, so it's very specific to a pathogen. So innate immunity is inherent in all animals and is ready to go from birth. So this is immunity to any wide range of infectious agents. Only 1% of animals, including humans, have adaptive immunity. And it has a delayed development. So adaptive immunity means, delayed development. You have to come into contact with something first to develop that immunity. So if you never come into contact with any pathogens, you'll never develop adaptive immunity. The innate immune system on its own has succeeded in protecting a diverse array of animals. So it is the first line of defense, and it really does work for most animals fairly well. So exterior anatomical structures that protect the animals from invading agents are examples of innate immunity, but there's also interior detection and response system, we'll look at some of those things as well, that make up innate immunity. So here's a nice side-by-side comparison of adaptive and innate immunity. So all animals have innate immunity, but only some vertebrates have adaptive immunity. In innate immunity, there's cell-mediated and secreted components, what we'll talk about. Okay, same thing in adaptive. Innate immunity is a very rapid response, right? Your skin is an example of something that's innate immunity. It's always there. It's there to protect your underlying tissues. Adaptive immunity, on the other hand, takes a long time to build a response over a period of being, exposed to something and then building that adaptive immunity. Innate is generic against most types of pathogens. Adaptive is specific. Innate immunity, the type of response does not vary, so it's the same for all pathogens, whereas it's going to be more rapid and efficient. So adaptive has memory. Adaptive immune system is going to remember in a sense. We'll talk about how that works, having these specialized cells kind of ready and waiting for when an infection comes into contact or a pathogen comes into contact with an organism. So our body has various innate protections that protect the openings in our body, which is where pathogens get in. So the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth are then going to be areas by which pathogens can enter the body. So how do we protect these? There's mucus and cilia that beat the mucus up and out. So if you have a pathogen in your throat or your chest, your body is going to want to try to remove that pathogen by coughing, right? So the coughing response, the sneezing response is to get those things out, right? Eyes, sometimes things can get in through the eyes. You've ever had an eye infection, right? A pink eye, something like that, you can end up with that. Blinking away wipes tears across the eye, and there's an enzyme, lysozyme, that also has an antibacterial property. You have hairs and earwax trapping pathogens in the ear, your nose, same thing. You've got mucus secretions, cilia is what's shown here. Same thing that we find in the throat and the chest area, lots of cilia in the throat. Okay. In the digestive tract, pathogens are trapped in saliva and mucus and then swallowed, and most pathogens are destroyed in the stomach by the low pH, the acidity of the stomach will destroy pathogens. So inside of the body, so those are all things that are pretty obvious outside the body, innate responses, but there's also inside the body innate immune response, and your white blood cells, your leukocytes, provide immediate generic response to a broad range of pathogens. Okay, so the innate response is nonspecific, but it will respond to groups of pathogens such as bacteria and fungi. So most of the time, you're going to be protected first and foremost by your leukocytes, unless something really nasty gets in there. Okay, so these leukocytes are alerted to the presence of foreign invaders by antigens. So on all of your cells, you've got various markers that say this is your cell. But these antigens that are on the surface of pathogens are different, and that alerts your body to enact its immune response and go after anything that has these foreign antigens. So we're going to be using the terms antigens and antibodies in this lecture, so just make sure you keep track of the difference. That an antigen is actually physically on the cell. It's a marker that says that's not your cell. And then what you're going to do in one of the body's adaptive responses is produce antibodies to that, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Okay, so on the left here we have the innate immune response. Okay, and these are all different cells that are going to present an immune response. So there's dendritic cells, monocytes, macrophages, natural killer cells, which produce a cytotoxic response. We'll talk about what that means. Basophils, eosinophils, neutrophils, these are all cells that are kind of ready to go. Now, it's kind of a little bit confusing because eosinophils, even though they're examples of innate immunity, do go after specifically like parasitic infections. Neutrophils and basophils go after specific things, so it's a little bit confusing there to think about it. But when we look at the adaptive response here, you're going to see it's much different with the B cells and the T cells, and kind of what's happening there with those. Okay. So the inflammatory response here is when we have a situation where the skin is broken and bacteria is going to get in there, other pathogens that can get into the wound. So in order to stop this, we have something called the inflammatory response, which is going to feel very hot to the touch. So the first thing that happens here, the bacteria are going to enter. Platelets from the blood are going to release blood clotting proteins at the wound site. Okay, that's going to begin the process of healing. Cells called mast cells are going to secrete factors that mediate dilation, constriction of blood vessels. Okay, and you're going to see delivery of blood, plasma, and cells, the injured area increasing. Cells called neutrophils secrete factors that kill and degrade pathogens. In this response, that's what these are doing here. Okay, so neutrophils are triggering a response to kill the pathogens, which you're going to see here. See, it's engulfing those pathogens. There's the mast cell. dilating and constricting the blood vessels. Neutrophils and macrophages secrete cytokines. Okay, so cytokines are basically like breadcrumbs, I think of them, and they signal to other immune system cells that you need to come and you need to get to this situation. So macrophages, in response to an infection, are going to secrete a whole bunch of these cytokines, and that's going to bring a whole bunch of other cells in from the immune system to initiate tissue repair in this case. So one of the things that they believe is happening in COVID-19 is when we get the coronavirus, the COVID virus in, these macrophages and other cells secrete a whole bunch of cytokines, and it creates something called a cytokine storm, where you have actually an overactive immune response, and it causes an overinflammation, and that causes actually people to die. So that is one reason why sometimes drugs are being pushed to actually decrease the immune response to COVID-19 to stop this cytokine storm from taking place. Okay. Ultimately, this response is going to continue until the foreign material is eliminated and the wound is repaired. Okay. So here's, again, kind of what we talked about already. I'm not going to rehash all of this, but these are the steps to the inflammatory response. Okay, so here's a nice table that kind of breaks down what all of these cells are that we talked about, so what they do in the innate immune system. Okay. Different signaling molecules besides cytokines. Histamine is one, and histamines are produced by mast cells and received by blood vessels, and what they do is they dilate the blood vessels. You may also have heard of histamines as being in a response to allergies. So overhistamine production, which is when your body produces too much of this in response to a pollen, let's say, which isn't really going to hurt you. Pollen's not going to hurt you, but your body is allergic to that. It's going to overproduce histamine. And that causes all the allergy symptoms: sneezing, runny nose, itchy eyes, stuff like that. Chemokines are a type of cytokine, and they are specifically involved in promoting dilation, increasing the permeability of blood vessels. Okay. And then cytokines we talked about. These are, again, I think of them as like breadcrumbs, marking the path to a wound, increasing the production of all of the other immune cells. Inducing a fever, okay, which raises the set point of your body temperature so that things run on hot and run a little bit quicker and kill this thing, and stimulate cells involved in wound repair. So you can see how increasing the amount of cytokines would actually lead to a lot of the symptoms we see of COVID-19. Okay, so that is the innate immune response. The adaptive immune response is a little bit more complicated. So this is based on the interactions between specific immune cells and a specific antigen. Now, if you go on to take, and I've said this before in here, future courses in immunology, even anatomy physiology, we'll get into this in much more detail. We're just going to kind of scratch the surface of adaptive immunity. It is, like I said, very complex. So one form of adaptive immunity uses antibodies, which are secreted proteins that bind to an antigen. So remember, the antigen is on the invading cell, and the antibodies are going to then bind to those antigens when they're produced. Okay? The adaptive immune response can respond to a seemingly limitless array of antigens. So if there's an antigen the body can come into contact with, it can produce antibodies to it. From what we can understand, a healthy immune system is very robust and can very much respond to any invader, old and new. So there's 4 key characteristics of the adaptive immune response. The first one is specificity. So antibodies, other components, bind only to specific sites on specific antigens. Okay, so this is the specific immune system. So we're going to see this being very important. Diversity. The adaptive immune response virtually recognizes all antigens. All right, so we see this very clearly in a healthy immune system. Memory. The adaptive immune response is stronger and quicker when you're exposed to antigens from previous infections. Right? We're going to see the importance of vaccines with memory in the adaptive immune system. Self and non-self recognition. So one of the major components of the immune system is recognizing self from non-self. So molecules that are produced by an individual do not normally produce a response. So that means that the immune system can distinguish between things that are your body versus things that are not your body. We see this also happening with organ tissue rejection and blood donations, keeping the blood types the same. All right, as another example of self and non-self. All right. So on the left, we have innate immunity. This is a great figure here that separates the different types of this. So innate immunity, the macrophages, natural killer cells, the eosinophils, neutrophils, basophils, dendritic cells, all right, are all going to be just strictly innate immunity. All right, the natural killer T cells and the T cells are involved in both adaptive and innate immunity. We'll talk a little about the difference. And then we've got the adaptive immunity, specifically dealing with the B cells, which produce antibodies, and then they sort of activate T cells to produce CD4 and CD8 T cells, and we'll talk about a little bit the difference between those. But that's your body's adaptive slow response. Okay. All right, so that's where I'm going to end part 1 of the immune system lecture.